All right, good morning, guys. So today I'm going to quick go through the bureaucracy. There's not as much here, so this video should be substantially shorter than the other three branches that I covered. And one thing we're going to address about the bureaucracy is how it's essentially this fourth branch of government within the executive that kind of just functions independently, even though it's sort of a part of that branch. So I want you to think of the bureaucracy as in giant layers. So our first layer would be those closest to the president. So like the department heads, the president can appoint those people based on a merit system, or they can just do it based on political patronage. So if they make the Department of Homeland Security someone who was giving them a lot of money during the campaign, that happens a lot. So there's up to about 400,000 employees that the president often will appoint in the upper layer so as it's approved by a simple majority. Um so you're gonna see though, there's 2.8 million people in our bureaucracy. So all of the people underneath that layer that I talked about, I refer to them as the second layer. So if we think about the second layer, that's those people are non-elected. They are appointed based on a merit system. So these people are experts in their fields serving under these agencies. So that is what the bureaucracy is. But we're gonna get more into the groups that they'll form, the way that the other branches can influence the bureaucracy, and how the bureaucracy actually will influence those branches. So we're going to see here with the instance of red tape, there's complicated bureaucratic rules and procedures required to actually get anything done. So because of that, the bureaucracy is infamous for being slow. Because it has to all of those layers have sublayers within them, and all of those sublayers have to interact with one another in order to finally accomplish something. And so what I have just described here is that second layer we consider a form of civil service. Bleh. We consider a form of civil service, and those people are hired based on the merit system. So the bureaucracy is infamous actually because people just get a bad rap from the word. It just symbolizes something being slow. And also, the Jacksonian administration with their spoil system didn't make it look so good. So people were all like, drain the swamp or whatever. But I guess you see that in modern day too. So I always forget to turn that thing off. I'm like so OCD sometimes. Um, so there's two main ways that the bureaucracy can form relationships with interest groups and congressional committees to get what they want done. And so I'm going to actually start with the specific and go to the general because I feel like these get mixed up easily. So if you understand this one first, this one might make more sense. So an issue network will come about when, say, legislation is proposed, and let's say a group of individuals and like the public officials and committee and some other interest groups, well, they don't like that proposed policy. So this mutual relationship between the interest group, congressional committee, and bureaucratic agency will stand together to work on either defeating, or if they liked it to begin with, they might be supporting that proposed policy. But I'm going to give you a little bit of an example if you want to think about it like this. Say you have, I don't know, say there's a proposed policy to loosen restrictions on um I guess you could say like orthophosphate um dump into our rivers or whatever. And so the EPA is like no 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 no. And so there's also committees that are interested in Congress in supporting how the EPA feels, and there's other individuals and interest groups that go behind the EPA to stand against that piece of legislation. And if they get enough people in Congress to support how they feel, perhaps the bill will die. And so that's the objective of an issue network. But I want you to think of this issue network as temporary. Once this issue is resolved, then it's gone. But this is not the case for iron triangles. So iron triangles are the same thing essentially in their relationship. It's an interest group, congressional committee, and bureaucratic agency, but they focus on similar issues for a long-standing relationship, and they do it for a long time, and they're constantly working together. And so, because it's not gonna disband after one piece of legislation, it's more formal and it's more ingrained. So you can kinda think of almost an iron triangle as a special type of issue network, if you wanna think of it that way, because they have the same groups involved. And so we talked about the merit system and patronage, and you can look at some of the historical implications of this on your own. And you can even look at some other governments and how they had a bureaucracy throughout world history, and you can compare them. But that's a story for another time because that's not going to be on our AP test. So there's two types of authorities that our bureaucracy can have. And I want you to think of this authority as, because the bureaucracy is so huge, in a sense, those in the lower level are kind of insulated from influence of the president, of Congress, but we'll get into ways that the president and Congress can influence them. But it's through these types of authority that they can promote what they need to. So discretionary authority is where the agency will decide whether to take certain actions or how they're going to implement the law. And sometimes this will happen when a law is kind of ambiguous and they're trying to decide like what's their jurisdiction, who who this legislation would target, how they're going to implement it. They need to figure that out, and they have discretionary authority to decide how to interpret that legislation. And so this is why sometimes, especially in the executive branch, even the president has in a sense some discretionary authority with his signing statements. People a lot of times are like reserve the interpreting to the judicial branch. So a lot of this sometimes rubs people the wrong way. They also have rulemaking authority. So for instance, like we'll go back to the EPA. They have rules and regulations they made based on legislation that was passed. And so that gives them the rulemaking authority. So because they have this authority, they were able to make rules that enforced their decisions of how to implement it back in discretionary authority. So these work hand in hand. And so anything underneath the agency, like states and corporations, need to comply. So corporations can't just be dumping radioactive waste into ponds. That would elicit a fine, and that would be violating the rules, so they would enforce their rulemaking authority. So without getting this too long, I just wanted to show you how these interacted and compare and contrast them. And so, although this is very visually pleasing, you're probably not going to need to know too much about these. I would just know in general what they are, and you can go over that on your own time. And so, there are many ways to hold the bureaucracy accountable, and we're often going to see Congress do this, but we also see the president do this daily with his executive orders. So we're first going to start with compliance monitoring, which is within the bureaucracy. And that's where bureaucracies check whether everything underneath them, including like regular citizens and corporations, are they following what is detailed by their rulemaking authority, as we talked about. So they have the right to influence whether people are complying with their laws, well, the way they're influencing the law, implementing. Bleh. It's like It was a long night. Um, so we're gonna now look at different types of oversight. So we have congressional oversight of the bureaucracy. And so Congress, say they don't like an agency, right? They can cut down its funding in the next federal budget, and they can have committee hearings to be super accusatory about how funds are being appropriated, but they also can give that agency more funding if they like what it's doing and they like how it's carrying out their legislation. And so there's a really interesting thing on Khan Academy. I actually recommend you watch the second half of it now that you'll have this information. It's about an interrogation between a senator and an FBI agent at a committee hearing. And it's actually quite fascinating to watch their interactions because you can see that it seems as though the agency representatives answer to Congress. So Congress has a lot of almost innate authority there, and I found that quite fascinating personally. Before I ramble on, let's get on to presidential oversight of the bureaucracy. So, though it is true that the president could just fire people that he appointed, that is only a certain number of people close to him, such as the department heads. But once you trickle down into the rest of the bureaucracy, he can't just fire those people without cause. And so the truth is, he would have to find legitimate reason to fire those people, and that's so difficult, and it's so hard for the president to pinpoint what's wrong about, well, every single person of the 2.8 million that are essentially working for him. So, but what he can do is if they're not implementing what he wants, he can do about 3 things, I believe. So, he can issue signing statements on legislation to begin with to narrow and focus the bureaucracy's scope of how they're going to implement the legislation the way that the president interprets it. He can also issue executive orders to perhaps split agencies into different departments to get things done, or he can make them follow different policies that he had in mind in order so that they implement his legislation properly. And by properly, I just mean in the way that he had intended it to be. And he can also shift responsibilities. Now, this happens now and then, and as we talked about in executive orders, if he were to split the agency, he might give responsibilities to one half, one to the other in order to make things more efficient, or he might just give that responsibility to another agency entirely if he finds that the agency with that he's having problems with isn't getting things done. And so we talked about this a little bit with policy and the branches of government. They all interact with one another. And so you can look at this on your own time, but we did talk about calling hearings. We didn't really talk about passing reform measures. And I think that's also important to mention actually because Congress, they can change what gets funded in an agency in order to fix the problem. But in addition, they can also pass legislation to limit the bureaucracy and limit the president in terms of how a policy might be carried out. So, say they don't like a policy and the bureaucracy is carrying it out. Well, they can pass legislation to limit the scope of what the president had implemented and what his bureaucracy is implementing. And as always, the judicial branch has judicial review so they can check everybody. And so, and I guess this is a key term you should probably know. Injunction there is when a bureaucratic official and or an action is found to be unconstitutional. So there isn't a whole lot that you're going to need to know about the bureaucracy. You just need to know its interactions with the other branches and just generally how it functions because there are so many. These are just the departments. There's agencies within these and there's so many workers. So I'm just going to take you quickly to here. As you can see, there are 362 terms, and though that may seem daunting, I promise you it is not because as I have expressed to you before, most of it is just quick questions that you go through after some brief descriptions that will reinforce what I showed you in this video. So I'm going to take you down to the bureaucracy section. That comprises only about, I would say, like 62 terms or so. And it's not long. So I can assure you, just take your time and you'll get through it, and just stay tuned for civil liberties, and that should be done probably by the end of today. All right, guys. Take care.